this. Happy lunch hour, everyone. This December 6th, 2021. My name is Sarah Dector. I'm the Comprehensive and Neighborhood Planning Manager for the City of Flagstaff. And this is Growth 201 in our Regional Snapshot series, which is part of an informational series that we are presenting about the background information we need to be successful in planning for Flagstaff's future. So what may be ahead for our region? These regional snapshots, there are about 30 of them, and we're getting to about the first third being done. They are most Mondays at noon. We're skipping some holidays, and we're actually going to have a 1-month break as well that I'll talk about. To attend them, you can go to our website at www.flagstaff.az.gov/regional plan 2045 and sign up to attend. Each presentation is a 15-minute presentation followed by a 15-minute Q&A. We post all of to the YouTube channel for the City of Flagstaff. It's important to know all the information being presented is a draft. The process of updating the regional plan takes approximately 2.5 years. And so this is the data we have today, and we will be producing snapshot reports that can be updated as new information becomes available throughout the process. So we have 2 more webinars before we take a break for the holidays. The first one is more on the regional economy, where Jack Fitchett from the City of Flagstaff and Chris Pastors from Coconino County will provide a more detailed economic overview than the one that was provided in early November. And then we will talk with Leah Bloom from the Flagstaff housing staff all about the 10-year affordable housing plan and housing in Flagstaff as a region. Then we'll have a break until about January 24th. So the regional plans, one of its main purposes is to just understand and describe our objectives, principles, and standards for local growth and redevelopment. With in mind many of the things we talked about last week of our smart growth principles, our conservation approach, what the recent growth in Flagstaff has meant and what it's been like, and how we've been managing growth. In the second part of this 2 video series, we will be talking about the distribution of growth and our growth projections and other trends that may influence the growth of Flagstaff and the surrounding region. When we say the term the Flagstaff region, we are specifically talking about this area within the green square. It is approximately from Belmont to Winona-Coznino, west to east, and from south to north, Mountain Air, to the northern side of the Kachina Peaks. Now, sometimes we think of Winslow or Williams or Tuba City as part of the region, but they are not part of it for this planning document, though we do discuss the influences of those surrounding communities and how they affect the smaller Flagstaff region and the larger Coconino County throughout this process. So our community is growing. This is just a fact. Flagstaff is actually growing at a faster rate than the rest of Coconino County. So since 2022, since 2000 to 2020, based on the US Census and the American Community Survey in particular, Flagstaff has seen a 45% population change. This was pretty typical of what we saw from 1980 to 2000 as well, just as a point of reference. Coconino County, however, has seen growth slowing, and in fact, some rural areas of Coconino County have seen declining growth. The Flagstaff region is the exception to that. We don't have an exact number on what our rate of change has been. So using some interpolation data that we do have available based on census tracts and census block groups, we think that the region grew about 33% over the same time period. However, we will hopefully be getting a more detailed projection. Like we said, these are draft projections. The state of Arizona is actually going to put out a more detailed projection soon. So going forward, those were our estimates. These are our projections from the Arizona Commerce Authority. They have not yet produced a projection for the Flagstaff region, though they intend to in 2022. But based on the projections we have right now, the growth in Coconino County, if we look at that mid scenario, could be about 162,000 by 2050. And Flagstaff as a city, not including the surrounding region, could be as many as 90,000 or more residents. This is an important piece to know, is that these are mathematical projections. And though they do account for some demographic subpopulations, they are not necessarily taking into account some of the macro trends that could speed up or slow down growth in certain portions of our community and our populations. So what's a macro trend? A macro trend is a trend that is usually at a much higher level than a local government control can manage, but that we are either having to respond to and mitigate or become prepared for ahead of time. So when we think about a macro trend, we are usually trying to respond to it with a mitigation strategy, or we're trying to get prepared for it ahead. Climate change is a great example of a macro trend that we want to watch. And macro trends are part of why, when we talk about growth, people feel very uncomfortable. And we often see emotionally, when we are discussing this topic, many expressions of fear. People have fear of uncertainty. Our brains are actually wired to prefer a predictable negative result over an uncertain result. And so when we see trends and we start talking about growth in this way, as there are macro trends, and we won't be able to predict all the things about them that may influence our community, this brings a real sense of unease. People worry about our community identity, about their role in the community and what that could mean, and about losing control of what we feel makes Flagstaff special. So when we talk through these, keep that in mind. Some of that uneasiness is very, very common to all of these conversations about growth. So construction trends and supply chain issues are probably something we're all become very familiar with in the last few years. Certainly the cost of lumber, of concrete, of labor, of equipment have all gone up, of the computer chips that we use in many everyday devices, of copper wires to run electrical in new buildings. As all of these costs have grown at a very fast rate, pushing up inflation, and it's a major impact to inflation, is just the construction industry alone. Flagstaff, as a place that is growing, is feeling those impacts. Another macro trend that we watch as we're talking about it is that when markets are looking at financing buildings and financing growth in a community, they tend to put a lot of money into a trend because there are reports and economic analysis that says it will be productive financially. And then if that trend starts to fizzle out, they move it quickly, some of that capital, into other new areas. And so it's never quite predictable how we make that move. A good example is the 2008 and 2009 recession, the Great Recession, when prior to that, single family home subdivisions were the preferred portion of the real estate market for large banks to invest in. And when the single family home market and the foreclosure trend occurred, that money didn't just dry up. Some of it was still there in the economy, but it was reinvested into larger multifamily projects due to the kind of national economic analysis that's used in the stock market and the financial markets to make those decisions. Likewise, we've just seen the passage of another large infrastructure bill, and how we spend that future funding will have long-term impacts on our community. NAU has seen for this last year a sudden decline in enrollment, but the long-term demographic projections of the cohort of people who will be 20 to 24 years old, which is approximately college age, is declining over the next 30 years. And so we have to ask some questions about whether NAU will be able to maintain or will see declines in their future enrollment. Climate migration is going to be another large influence in Arizona. As things heat up in places like Tucson and Phoenix, our largest metropolitan areas, people will either adapt to the heat or they will start to move out of those communities to find cooler places to live. And likewise, some jobs will follow. How well positioned is Flagstaff to be a part of that change, either in the housing market or the job market, is another trend we are watching. Telecommuting and all of the changes we've seen in our work life since the pandemic started will also be a part of this conversation, as will the secondary home market in terms of short-term rentals, people who are speculating on housing because of those particular influences on our communities, and they're looking at quality of life communities as Flagstaff, such as Flagstaff, as being ones that can be influenced by that in terms of investments. So none of those things are things Flagstaff controls, but we have to watch indicators in all of these macro trends to be responsive and to understand what our future growth scenarios could look like and how they could play out. That was a rather long slide, but we covered a lot of ground. So I want to go back to talking about the growth that Flagstaff has seen now that we're thinking about all those macro trends. Land costs in the city of Flagstaff have been growing very quickly, and we'll talk more about that during the housing discussion. This map shows you census blocks, which are the smallest geography that the census uses to track information about population and demographics. And those blocks, we have tied the number of new units based on our building permit data in each of these census blocks. So when you look at this, you'll see that there's lots of areas within the city of Flagstaff that have seen 0 new units. Those are the gray areas on the map. But there are several census tracts that have had over 250 new units added, especially on the west side of Flagstaff. And there are many places that have had 50 to 100 small new subdivisions, houses that were filling out existing subdivisions like Pine Canyon and Flag Ranch. And then also this infill development that we've seen, and some others out in the Donny Park and Timberline area. When we take that data and we bring it up a geographic level to the census block groups, which combines all those little blocks into larger geographies, you'll see that there is some trends about central Flagstaff, and especially west central Flagstaff, being a place to see the fastest growth in the community. That probably fits well with what people have observed in these areas of our community. There was very few housing units between kind of the Sunnyside neighborhood and the Cherry Hill and downtown neighborhoods prior to the last 10 years, but we've seen growth in that area, which is approximately this little bubble of dark blue. And then we've also seen Presidio and new subdivisions on the west side, as well as several of these student housing developments in this core area in and around NAU and the south side. It's not an accident that the growth was occurring in those locations. When the city of Flagstaff was working on our high occupancy housing plan, we looked at our infrastructure and readiness for large multi-story mixed-use buildings. And we looked at our water, our sewer, our transportation system, transit availability, bike and ped availability. And these darkest green areas on the map were the areas that if you owned a property in that area and you wanted to build a development like that, like the hub, like the Uncommon, you had to do the least offsite investment because the infrastructure and all the pieces needed to support that growth already existed. Supply is a different issue that's handled at the regional plan level. And I'd just like to make sure I mention that the city of Flagstaff, our utility system, has a 100-year water supply designation from the Arizona Department of Water Resources that is reviewed every 5 years and stress test for climate change and other difficulties that may occur as the climate is evolving over the next few years. So this area on this map, which we call the Readiness Map, shows only those areas already zoned. So we assumed if you wanted an area ready to build a housing development like that, which largely corresponds to our activity center direction in the regional plan, you would want an area that's already zoned to allow that use. We also looked at areas with potential. They're central, they have an activity center identified in our policy level documents, they have some utility infrastructure, but you may have to rezone a property. And so that's what this map indicates, is what portions of the city really have the kind of infrastructure and availability that supports housing at a multi-story mixed use level. And this is what the city uncovered, is there's some areas that are very well suited and some areas that have more investment needed if that kind of development is something the city wants to see there in the future. But I think this is important because the last time we were revising the regional plan, we didn't look at this analysis. And so we didn't really recognize that there were areas that once the financing and all those macro trends aligned would be ready to go and would be buildable very, very quickly with new kinds of development that we really hadn't seen at that level prior to 2014. This is our policy document that was adjusted for the high occupancy housing plan. We first had different activity center alignment in several locations. And when we did the high occupancy housing plan, we took that data, understanding how growth was happening, and we made adjustments to the regional plan that included upgrading these red activity centers, or regional activity centers, into this central portion of Flagstaff. You'll see that corresponds to the blue area on the map that we looked at when at the block group level pretty closely. And then we also talked about where these secondary activity centers that might not grow as fast, but might have some growth as well. I think what we've seen is that activity centers and continuing to complete existing neighborhoods have been a large part of the pattern of growth we've seen over the last 10 years. So there's lots more to be curious about with this topic. That was a very quick overview of something that we will be talking about in our scenario planning effort very in depth. But what some things to be curious about between now and maybe about 8 or 9 months from now when we may start that effort is what other macro trends might we see in the next 20 to 50 years? And we certainly have been thinking about some public health ones and what it looks like if pandemics become a more regular part of our society and our patterns. How will we be able to mitigate or prepare for macro trends like climate change, technological innovations, especially those that might affect transportation? I always think it's good to remember that the horse and buggy was the major form of transportation in 1900. And by 1940, it was completely replaced by a car. And so that kind of change can happen in 20 or 30 or 40 years and happen very rapidly. So we need to be thinking, what does that mean if we grow differently, if our transportation system looks different? And then, a grounding core part of these growth conversations that will probably start even earlier this spring are what values will be the basis for making future decisions about growth for our community. Because we have some very strong values, and we do hope that as all of these trends and changes come to play, we're able to hold on to those and move forward. That's one of the things that the regional plan does as well as it can with every time we update it. And then I just put up here a little quick quote by Lao Tzu, a famous philosopher: if you do not change your direction, you may end up where you are going. And so I think this is the kind of quote that helps remind us we are on some trajectory to the future. There is no Peter Pan moment where we get to stay locked in a moment in time. And the times where we were revising and updating our regional plan, conducting these analysis and these community conversations are the times we get to choose to change direction. And if we don't, we are going to end up somewhere different than where we are now. We just get to decide where, or if we are going to go along with the current and see where it takes us. So thank you again for engaging in these interesting, but sometimes difficult conversations with staff and with the city and the county. And I will stop sharing if you would like to raise your hand, and I'd be also happy to go to any slides. And if there are no questions, I'll stop recording. Thank you everyone for attending today's webinar. Have a good day.